Welcome to History 111, Lecture 15, The Early Republic. The early republic is a growing nation. There are 14 states, with Vermont having been admitted to the Union shortly after the passage of the Constitution. It is a nation of 3.9 million inhabitants, with about 750,000 African Americans, the overwhelming majority of whom were enslaved at that time, and about 150,000 Native Americans who aren't counted as part of the first census. About 48% of all the counted inhabitants of this new republic are under the age of 16, so it's a very young and growing nation. Here we can see a map of what this looks like. You can see the original colonies and so on, and you can see there's all this new territory that's beginning to be organized and divided up, and really is there for expansion. So with the passage of the new Constitution, this growing nation gets its first president, George Washington, and he becomes what's known as the presidency of presidents because he establishes a lot of traditions that continue on to this day. He establishes having a very strong cabinet made up of real intellectuals like Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Randolph. He starts off what he calls Tuesday levees, which are social gatherings where members of the public, albeit only men, could come in and meet the president and discuss various matters of concern. George Washington also decides that he doesn't want a big fancy title. He's going to be Mr. President, and he's going to keep it simple. And George Washington models his presidency to a certain degree on a Roman dictator known as Cincinnatus, who took power during a war, during a crisis, and then when the crisis is over, he returned it back to the Senate and retired out in peace to leave everybody to their democracy. So George Washington kind of modeled himself as the man who would step up during a crisis and take control, but ultimately did not want power. He just wanted to do what was good and right and then retire quietly away. During Washington's presidency, one of the key figures is Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, and he comes up with what were called Hamilton's schemes, and that wasn't necessarily a compliment. A lot of people were opposed to what he was doing, and they involved a tariff of 1798, public credit, national banks, national minting, reporting on manufacturing, all things that were designed to strengthen American currency, deal with debt, deal with taxation, and really boost the economy. Now, there are a lot of consequences of what Hamilton proposed. There are a lot of political and sectional debate on whether or not central government should be involved in this type of thing, and the constitutional issues arise over what is necessary and proper, and there's a political schism that emerges from this. Some people think that no matter whether or not what Hamilton's doing is in the national interest, it's not within the Constitution, and therefore Hamilton can't do it. Other people say this elastic clause in the Constitution about necessary and proper gives the central government authority to do what they need to do, and therefore what Hamilton's doing is legal because it's good for the country. And that political fight over is Hamilton right or not leads to the genesis of the first party system, Federalists versus Republicans, those who are looking at strong central government and those who are looking at ensuring that it is limited. In addition, there's also the Whiskey Rebellion at the time, which involves a lot of those taxes and people taking up arms, and that's the first use of American federal troops is putting that down. And although all these things happen and there's this big debate, the ultimate consequence is Hamilton strengthens national government by doing these things. Now, at the conclusion of Washington's presidency, he makes his farewell address, which is very important because, again, Washington is really the man who sets the tone, and he talks about no permanent alliances with Europeans. But he says temporary ones are okay, but this results in a myth that kind of persists in U.S. history that we really ought to stay out of European affairs and not get involved in alliances because alliances will be bad for us. And that's going to be an issue we're going to see in the 20th century. Now, importantly, is the way Washington's presidency ends. It's the 1796 election. First, Washington will not stand for a third term, and that leads to a tradition whereby American presidents do 2 terms and leave. That becomes a matter of constitutional law later on, but that's at this point just simply a tradition. You can be president as many times as you want to be, and Washington says, no, I've done 2 terms, it's time for me to leave, it's time for me to hand over power to someone else. And really importantly for a new country is an orderly transfer of power. There's no big fight. Where countries fail when they're brand new is not in the first leader's term, it's when that leader hands over to someone else. And for the United States, it's very successful, very orderly transfer of power. Now, out of this, in this election, you see 2 major factions. The Federalists would asking for John Adams to be president and nominating Thomas Pinckney for vice president, and the Republicans under Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now what happens is Adams wins the elections and he becomes president. And under Adams, this Federalist because of the way the Constitution is written at the time, which is going to be later amended, Jefferson, who had the second most votes, is going to become the vice president. Now, during the Adams presidency, foreign affairs become much more central, with the British and French repeatedly violating U.S. neutral rights, and that has a lot to do with the French Revolution. There's also the XYZ affair, in which U.S. diplomats are trying to get France to stop interfering with U.S. shipping. There's the quasi-war with France, where even though we're not at war for real, there's a lot of fighting going on the seas because of interference with shipping, and all of that is really starting to take up a lot of time because of events back in Europe. On the domestic front, there's another tax rebellion, and that is because taxes go up to pay for all these things that are going on internationally. And really importantly comes the Alien and Sedition Acts. That becomes one of the major events of Adams' presidency. So the Alien and Sedition Acts really involve a couple of different things. First is what are the requirements to become a U.S. citizen. This had been previously established in bills passed 1790 and 1795, but under the Adams presidency, they're going to increase the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years. In addition, the Alien Acts are going to give Congress heightened powers, and they're going to allow the deportation of foreign persons that the federal government deems dangerous. Now, Republicans really object to provisions for prosecuting citizens who concealed aliens or inhibited the enforcement of the act, and they felt that that was going to be a major imposition on American civil liberties. On top of that is the Sedition Act, which authorized the prosecution of any public assembly or publication critical to the government. Now, the Federalists and Adams are going to be really for these heightened powers in dealing with this foreign crisis with Britain and France. The Republicans, on the other hand, are going to see this as a major and unacceptable trampling on American civil liberties. Now, in response to the Alien Sedition Acts, two important resolutions are going to come with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, the Kentucky resolution was introduced by John Breckinridge, although it was authored by the sitting Vice President Thomas Jefferson, and the Kentucky House adopts it in 1798, as does the Kentucky Senate. Now, the Virginia resolution is going to be introduced by John Taylor, although it's authored by James Madison. So we have two real heavy hitters when it comes down to American thinking. The author of Declaration of Independence and the primary author of the Constitution are going to adopt these resolutions that are going to go against these particular laws. So what the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions say is that the Constitution is a compact, and the central government has powers that are enumerated by the Constitution, and all those powers which are not enumerated were reserved to the states. And what he's saying in those two resolutions, both Madison and Jefferson, is accepted as general constitutional law. This is not controversial, what they've said. Most people know this and agree with this at the time. It's their conclusions that go in a different direction, though. What those two resolutions include is the Alien Sedition Acts assumed undelegated powers that should have been left to the states, and therefore the states have the right to declare the Alien and Sedition Acts as void, and that's highly controversial what they said there. Now, none of the other states respond positively to these resolutions. 7 of the 9 states north of Potomac are going to go ahead and put their objections in writing and send them to the legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia. Most of those states in the north are going to rebuke Kentucky and Virginia and basically call them out for this. Now, most state legislatures feared these resolutions because if they were accepted and approved, this would totally tear the Union apart by undoing the very strong central government that had been settled in the Constitution, and it would go back to some type of unworkable situation like the Articles of Confederation, and they believed that in doing that, ultimately the United States would collapse and splinter into a number of different states. Now, Adams does only one term. Things like the Alien Sedition Acts and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions really polarized American politics, and when the election came, the Republicans won. Now, importantly, it's another peaceful transition of power. Not only have we gotten past the first leader with a peaceful handover, we've gotten through a divisive election with a peaceful handover, and that's really important for the future of American government. So what's the big idea here? Well, in the early republic, Washington sets the tone. Divisions emerge over things like Hamilton's schemes and the Kentucky and Virginia resolution. And through all of that, there's a peaceful transition of power that is really showing that the American government, all it's developing, is going to be a strong and lasting one. But importantly also, this issue of nullification, this idea that states can void federal laws when they think they go against the Constitution, is ultimately going to be a potential crisis later on.